Bigger, Better, Bolder was an attempt to do things differently. Most organisations, when they talk about housing, they ask a question of which there's an obvious answer. Yes, the lack of housing supply impacts on need and impacts on house prices. But actually, there's a whole set of other questions that we should be asking.
We wanted to have a chance to have a conversation with some of our key external partners about the future challenges for London, and we were keen to get some different voices as part of that. So the people we chose to facilitate the main speaker were perhaps putting a different slant on things, posing different questions.
We constrain our cities now with green belts rather than actually try to imagine how we could inhabit the countryside, which I think would be a fairly worthwhile ambition given the rising populations. We need more space. We have it, but we don't seem to have the ambition to be able to use it.
We had Yolanda Barnes from Savills, and she's an expert on global markets. So that was absolutely fascinating in terms of her global perspective around what was happening within the city and what she was seeing from other world-class cities and their anticipation of the future.
We will spend the next 50 years worrying a lot more about the outer suburbs in the way that we worried about the inner city in the 80s and 90s. It's going to be the outer suburbs that present the biggest challenge for London.
London will be a city-state or a province in its own right.
Embracing Reading, Slough, Milton Keynes actually being suburbs of London rather than separate places.
My session at the event was about demographics. Lucy and I went back behind the statistics and really had a look at what was happening. You'd think the key issue about demographic change going forward was continued in-migration. And whereas that's part of the story, it's not a big part of the story. The key thing is the changes in birth and death patterns.
The ageing population is one of the big challenges for us, and we know that in the next 10 years there's going to be a 23% increase of people living with long-term conditions like dementia. So we've got to think about how we deal with that.
What do people who rent do when they retire? How do you carry on renting the house that you rented while you were working?
I chaired one of the sessions and I found it incredibly interesting because questions were being posed that I've not seen raised in other such fora. Whether there is a way of persuading the general population to support investment in housing when in fact most voters are actually quite decently housed.
We have to decide what we want to have as a future and make that happen. And I think the future is going to be important if we think about the moral objectives of what we want to do.
I think that we're able to provide places that people who want to live in London can afford to do so.
Shared ownership is the way forward. Make that more accessible, get more of it.
We don't have to simply pursue profit, and that puts us in a uniquely powerful position to be able to do something about it, but it puts a huge responsibility on us to work in partnership.
We see the South Bank as really one of the great symbols of change and progress in London.
I spoke about the history of South Bank. I wasn't sure whether looking backward would be significant, but having given that speech, I realised that the history of South Bank is incredibly relevant to the future of Catalyst Housing.
So that energy, that transformation, was something that we wanted to tap into as the sort of background to the discussion.
What I've come to realise today is that we're really at the cusp. We're on a pivot point of which way things can go over the next 50 years. Either we accept that more housing supply is needed, or we continue the mistakes of the last 50 years in undersupplying housing, which has a fundamental economic effect.
I think 50 years' time, I think there'll still be a housing shortage. I don't think there's any question of that.
I think they would talk about why did we not build taller buildings, bigger buildings, why we didn't develop in a more spectacular way.
I think we will be talking about how we have created incredibly dense, humane cities which are green, properly functioning, quite social. I think we'll have talked about the end of suburbia.
We might also be talking about how Greater London has become even greater.
The thing I'm going to take away from today's event is a great deal of optimism, and I've been particularly impressed by the work that Catalyst have been doing in Kensington, and I think that is a good example of the way in which housing could go in the future, especially in London.
think the key thing that came out of today was that people should be more bold and ambitious.
Collaboration is incredibly important.
I heard ideas that I'd never really thought before because it was outside of my normal comfort zone.
We need to see all our housing as the same, whether we're letting it at subsidised rent or a higher rent. We have to see it as the same management standards.
And we have to find the people to work with who think the same way as us, so that we can actually do great things.
Look back 50 years, where have we come from, what has been achieved? If you have the vision, if you have the passion and you have a clear plan, there's no limit to what we can achieve in the next 50 years.